So I'm Matti Leino. I'm a researcher in Stockholm University at the Archaeological Research Laboratory, and I have a background in agronomy and plant breeding and genetics. But I've been working the last 15 years with questions on cultural history of plants, first in the Nordic Museum and now since a couple of years at Stockholm University. And now we're moving to a completely different angle of looking on heritage cereals, and I will talk about the history of Nordic landrace barley and how you can resolve that history by genetics. So first, just a few words about barley. Barley is a cereal that could be cultivated anywhere in the Nordic countries where you could have agriculture. And it is a multi-purpose cereal. You can use it for bread, for porridge, for beer, for fodder, and etc. And it has been cultivated in Scandinavia as long as we have had agriculture, more or less. And that is 6,000 years in southern Scandinavia, maybe 3,000–4,000 years in Finland. And these facts make barley really interesting to study because barley is perhaps the cereal that has had the longest time of local adaptation to Nordic conditions, and also adaptations to these different end uses. And then just a few words on the different groups of barley, or our barley vocabulary. And you usually divide barley into three different groups based on different characters. First, we have the two-row barley and the six-row barley. And in the two-row barley, only two fertile grains are formed on each node in the spike, whereas on six-row barley, you have six, or actually 3 + 3 grains on each node in the spike. You also divide between winter barley and spring barley. The winter barley is sown in the autumn and the spring barley is sown in the spring. And historically, almost only spring barley has been used in the Nordic countries. And we also have hulled barley, where the seed husk is attached to the grain, and naked barley, where the seed husk is not attached to the grain. And you can have all kinds of combinations of these. You can have autumn sown two-row naked barley, or spring barley that is 6-row and hulled, etc. But today I will only focus on hulled 6-row spring sown barley. And that is the type of barley that was dominating in the Nordic countries from the Bronze Age until the early 20th century. And I'm interested in land races, and I know we define land races differently within this auditorium. But I look upon land races in this way. The farmer has a field with variability within his field, and then he takes parts of his harvest and use as seed for the next year. You see that on top here of the screen, and use it for seeds as next to the next year. And he does that recurrently, year after year after year. And then there are different forces acting on this population. There could be gene flow from the top here, that the farmers bring in some additional grains from a neighbor or from more distant sources. There might be selection acting on the field, that some genotypes within the field really don't manage that well under the farmer's conditions or the local conditions. And there might also be genetic drift. That is the random loss of genotypes. And genetic drift will act more strongly if the populations are small, because then the chance that random genotypes are lost increases. So what we do in our type of research is that we genetically genotype by molecular markers the variability within the different land races. And by doing that, we can actually get estimates on these different forces. And by comparing these different land races from different environments, we can actually see how adaptations and seed exchange and etc. have been acting on the farmers' fields. But being able to do this, we need to find the most genuine landrace material we have. And unfortunately, the Nordic Gene Bank has only a rather small collection of Nordic barley landraces. The genetic integrity of some of these can be questioned, and thus we use historical seed collections instead. This is the collection in the Nordic Museum. It was collected in 1896 for an exhibition, and we can take seeds from this seed collection. The seeds cannot germinate, but we can extract DNA from the seeds. There are similar collections in Finland, and here we see some famous people. And we do take out the seeds from these seed containers, and we do genotyping of the individual grains. And each circle here represents one landrace from that geographical position. And the color of the circle represents the genetic group they belong to. And what you can see here on this picture is that more or less three main groups can be seen within the Nordic countries. There's a southern group here, both in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, colored green. There's a middle group here, colored yellow, and there's a northern group here, colored blue. And this is pretty interesting because they make sense. The environmental conditions are sort of similar in the southern parts of the Nordic countries, in the middle part, and in the northern parts. So they are naturally adapted to the local conditions. But the really interesting thing here is that we have the same groups in Norway, in Sweden, and in Finland. And this means that the historical farmers must have known that the grain was locally adapted and exchanged grain independent on the borders. Because this pattern could not have occurred naturally by genetic drift or selections. There must have been some kind of exchange between farmers within the groups, and the farmers must have known about the restrictions of the different groups. And then we've been continuing, this is our main pattern, but then we've been doing some more detailed studies. This is just an example of what we believe that this most northern group, the blue group, looked like, the fjällkorn or Finnish barley or Laponian barley. We did a more detailed study of this Laponian barley and tried to figure out were there also small temporal differences. And we looked especially on detail on samples from the late 19th century when there were repeated crop failures in this area. And we sampled grains from all these different locations, and we found two main groups, the blue group and the yellow group. And then we tried to correlate these with different factors. We tried to correlate it with geography, with latitude, with altitude. But the only factor we could correlate these two groups to were actually age. And the older group, the blue group, were found in the oldest accessions, where the more young accessions from the 1890s were more yellow. So we think that these crop failures resulted in limited seed amount and that new varieties were brought into the area after the crop failures, because the yellow groups more resembled the type of barley they were grown more southernwise. We did a regional study in Jämtland, and actually here we could find a new group. We still have our three main groups here colored differently: orange, light blue, and dark blue. But in Jämtland around Lake Storsjön, there seemed to be a unique barley, not related to anything. In the peripheral areas of Jämtland, they used the more ordinary type of barley, meaning that these farmers have been trading seeds both with Norway and the east coast of Middle Sweden, whereas the farmers around Lake Storsjön have kept true to their own type of barley, Jämtlandskorn. And we have also been trying to dig deeper in history to see if our patterns are stable over really long time periods. These are archaeological grains derived from a grain in Lund from the late 17th century. It's the grave of Peter Winstrup, and you see the barley grains derived from here, they match really close to this southern group I showed you previously. This accession here, NM777, is actually from Skåne. So even though 250 years passed between these two time periods, the Scanian farmers seem to have been grown more or less the same type of barley over this time period. Now I'm running out of time. I should just say a few words. We are continuing this in different ways. We're looking now into two-row barley and see if it follows the same patterns. We're looking into early plant breeding, about naked barley, and more studies into deep history of landrace barley. That's it. Here are some of our publications if you want to dig more into this, but you find it on the shared presentation.